Hello and welcome to lecture 14 of the Fiat Standard online course. Today's lecture's topic is Bitcoin scaling. We're going to look at the question of Bitcoin scaling. And this is something I had discussed in the Bitcoin Standard. One of the main topics of the Bitcoin Standard was the idea that Bitcoin scales in layers, that Bitcoin won't scale on chain, and that we can think of Bitcoin as being more like a final settlement system for payments rather than a consumer payment system. Well, in the Fiat Standard, I get into this in more detail, and I think a very important point to answer about the question of how Bitcoin interacts with Fiat, which is the topic of this book, is to understand how Bitcoin scales. It's not a foregone conclusion that Bitcoin can scale. We need to understand how it works, and we need to understand the risks and the trade-offs that are involved. So, in this chapter, I'll try and explain the problem of Bitcoin scaling and try and introduce how I think it can be solved. To begin with, the world does currently around 2 to 3 billion what is called non-cash transactions per day. In other words, around 2019 it was around 2 billion, and they expect by 2023 it'll be around 3 billion per day. So it's almost half transaction per person. These are the non-cash digital transactions that are done daily in the world. So credit cards, bank transfer, all of these kinds of payments, there's about 2 to 3 billion per day. On the other hand, Bitcoin's highest day of transaction was around 500,000 transactions. So the most transaction Bitcoin has ever done was about 500,000, which is roughly 0.017% of all transactions that take place, digital transactions that take place in the world. So Bitcoin needs to increase its on-chain capacity by around 6,000-fold to handle all the world's current digital transactions, which is an enormous increase. And many people have tried to scale Bitcoin by increasing its block size. Many people thought, all right, well, each block of Bitcoin transactions currently is around 1 megabyte, and it fits something like 2,000 to 3,000 transactions. Well, if we double the size, then we can double the number of transactions per block, and then instead of having 500,000 transactions per day, we can have millions and millions if we just keep making the blocks bigger. This is the naive first approximation to the issue of scaling. All right, each 10 minutes we have a block of transactions. Currently, the block of transactions handles a few thousand transactions. If we 10x it, we'll get 10 times as much capacity. If we 100x it, we'll get 100 times as much capacity. This is basically what a lot of early Bitcoiners thought, and also what most shitcoiners tend to think. When you look at what altcoins do when they discuss scaling, it's clear that pretty much anybody in altcoin space doesn't understand Bitcoin and the scaling trade-off that Bitcoin made. So they all, well, not all, but I mean a lot of them, initially, of course, and here's how it works. They initially market their blockchains as being able to scale on-chain, and they come at it with this approach of scaling. And then when they try and make it work, they realize, oh, wait, this doesn't work. So then they resort to other kind of scaling solutions and try and present these as being innovative, but really all they're doing is just copying the bad ideas from Bitcoin. So all these attempts to scale Bitcoin by brute increase of the block size have failed. Raising the block size makes it harder to sing a node and results in centralization. That's a central point of the Bitcoin standard. And decentralization compromises efficiency. This is, I think, an important point that we need to understand. So coordinating the same data on thousands of nodes is always more expensive than a few nodes. So there's no way around it. Decentralization makes the process of running a digital currency or any currency much more inefficient, in that you have to have thousands of computers come to agree on the state of the network every 10 minutes. And that's a lot more complicated than if you just had one centralized computer and you had a couple of backups, and that centralized computer could agree with itself and the backups on what needed to be done. Rather than having an open network where thousands of people from all over the world need to come in and be brought to terms every 10 minutes with everybody else on the network. So it's just much harder to decentralize if you're focused on efficiency, and it's much harder to be efficient if you're focused on decentralization. And that's really the problem with this kind of scaling, the idea that we can just scale Bitcoin by increasing the size of the blocks in Bitcoin is that it compromises the centralization. Yes, it makes Bitcoin more efficient. We can have a lot more transactions. Instead of having 500,000, yeah, we could do 5 billion a day. If we just do 100x, do a 10,000x increase in the size of the block size. But then if you increase the block size by that much, that means that every 10 minutes, every computer on the network needs to download a block of transactions that is that big. So currently, if you wanted to scale to handle all current global non-cash transactions, you need to download a new block of transactions that is around 5 terabytes in size every 10 minutes. So 5 terabytes in size every 10 minutes is just an enormous amount of transactions. Your laptop's hard drive is probably only 1 terabyte. Or less than 1 terabyte. It might be 2, maybe 3, maybe 4. So imagine you need to download all the contents of something like 10 average laptops. If you think about it, maybe the average laptop has 500 gigabytes of data on it. So something like the data that's on 10 laptops, all the data that's on the laptops need to be downloaded every 10 minutes to your computer. Basically, it's nowhere near possible for any commercially available hardware to handle something like this. There are no laptops that you can buy from Amazon or Best Buy or whatever electronics shop where you can have a laptop that can add 5 terabytes of data from the internet onto its hard drive every 10 minutes. We just don't have those things. You can buy perhaps such kind of equipment, but it'll be extremely specialized, extremely expensive. It's not for commercial users. So if we did come up with a Bitcoin that had 5 terabyte blocks, how many people are going to be able to afford that node? Maybe there are a few people. I'm not sure if that's even possible, that you could have a machine that can keep up with 5 terabytes of download every 10 minutes. I presume there must be computers that can do this, but I don't know how expensive they are. I presume they must be extremely expensive. Assuming that it can be done, how many people do you think might be able to buy this kind of machine? It's not going to be anywhere like the number of people that currently buy the requirements for running a Bitcoin node. You can currently run a Bitcoin node on your laptop, or you can run it on a specialized computer or a small Raspberry Pi, or you can get a specialized node device that's made specifically to be a computer node. So there are all these options for things that you can make, that you can use for making a Bitcoin node, which cost somewhere in the range of, a few $dozen or a few $100. For, $500, $600, you can get the most incredible computer dedicated to just running a node. You can get a specific computer, like for instance Nodl. They sell these machines optimized just to run Bitcoin and isolated from all other devices on your computer, from all other programs on your computer, which is good to basically make it not easy to attack it. So if you did something like this, if you did increase the block size, you're going to end up with a much more centralized network, and then you're going to have a few people in charge of the network. So that's not going to work. Bitcoiners have fought tooth and nail against this over the years and have succeeded, and it's just not going to happen. Bitcoiners value the ability to run their node software on their own computer, because that's the only thing that makes the network resistant to censorship, resistant to inflation, resistant to confiscation, resistant to Keynesianism, basically. The only way that we have something that works to stop the Keynesians is because we have it decentralized. It's because there's no central authority for them to compromise. There's no way for the fiat cartel to destroy Bitcoin because there's no individual authority they can compromise, basically. So it gets harder and harder the more decentralized it is. And so scaling Bitcoin by increasing the number of transactions on chain is going to compromise the decentralization of Bitcoin, which is going to compromise the entire value proposition, which is going to make the entire thing a centralized knockoff of PayPal. So we already have PayPal. It's centralized, and it can do billions of transactions on its own proprietary network. It's all being settled on internal databases. No money has to move when you pay people on PayPal. They just change the number of change the amount of money in your balance and increase the amount of money in somebody else's balance, and that's it. So we can have a centralized system that's extremely efficient and fast for individual transactions. But if we want to have a decentralized system, it needs to have it needs to have its speed handicapped effectively by decentralization in order to ensure that nobody gets to control it. It needs to be very easy for thousands of people around the world to be able to run the software, and it needs to be very easy for them to arrive at consensus every 10 minutes. And that's not going to happen if you're handling everybody's coffee. It just gets way too complicated.
The Bitcoin Standard Podcast is brought to you by thesafehouse.com, my independent publisher and bookshop, selling the best Bitcoin books in high-quality cloth hardcovers built to last for generations. Most books these days are pretty fiat. They're flimsy and they fall apart quickly, and I did not want that for my books, so I set up the Safe House especially to provide you with beautiful, long-lasting classic cloth hardcovers you can proudly pass down for generations. You can get copies of my 3 books, The Bitcoin Standard, The Fiat Standard, and Principles of Economics, and you can also get copies of Lynn Alden's Broken Money, Parker Lewis's Gradually Then Suddenly, and Matthew Lysiak's Fiat Food, to which I contributed a few chapters, and Mexican billionaires Ricardo Salinas Pliego's new book, The Bitcoin Enlightenment. We now offer bulk discounts so you can buy books for yourself and for the friends and family you'd like to learn about Bitcoin. Buy any 2 books for $50, any 5 books or more for $20 per book, and for more than 50 books, it's only $15 per book. Go to thesafehouse.com, the SAIF house.com, where you can get all of these books in high-quality cloth hardcovers, delivered worldwide, and get 10% off for paying with Bitcoin. With fiat money constantly debasing, preserving your wealth isn't an option or luxury. It's a financial and moral imperative. If you're familiar with my work, you know the only financial advice I ever give is to buy and hold Bitcoin for the long term. This has never failed anyone. If you want to buy Bitcoin, I strongly recommend using Swan, a group of hardcore Bitcoiners laser focused on making Bitcoin easily accessible. While most scramble to react to each new crisis, Swan private clients are already positioned in the only monetary asset with absolute scarcity, Bitcoin. Swan Private partners with families and institutions who share a principled conviction in Bitcoin as the foundation for multi-generational wealth. With concierge service, deep expertise, and uncompromising security, the Swan team helps clients exit the crumbling fiat system and secure their future in sound money. Today, Swan Private serves more than 5,000 high net worth clients who have purchased more than $4.5 billion of Bitcoin and put it into cold storage. If you're ready to move beyond the false promises of fiat, start your long-term Bitcoin strategy at swan.com/safe, SAIF.
So, does this mean that Bitcoin never scales? Well, no. I still think, even though the blockchain itself, on-chain transactions can't scale themselves to handle all of the world's payments, Bitcoin itself can scale and will have to scale by conducting second layer transactions. The reason for that, I believe, is simply because hard money is something that cannot stay niche. It's not a technology that can just remain in a small, little corner of the internet used by a small group of people. It's something that's going to have to be widely adopted. It's just going to win. It's not a technology that can be isolated from people who don't want to use it. As I say in the Bitcoin Standard, you cannot isolate yourself from the implications of people using harder money than yours. If they use a harder money than yours, that means the amount of the value of their money appreciates over time, and the value of your money depreciates over time. And so over time, they have more money and you have less money. This is not a trend that you can ignore, because it just means that they're able to buy more and more of your stuff, and then they can essentially own more and more things while you can own less and less things. So they'll have more capital, they'll have higher productivity, and you have the easier money. In the Bitcoin Standard, I gave the example of the glass beads, the seashells, and silver. All of these things were money at some point, but they all were demonetized by harder money. When harder money came around, these things all lost their monetary premium. Silver lost to gold, seashells lost to gold, glass beads lost to gold. They all lost to gold because gold is harder. It's not because people changed their mind, one day silver stopped being popular and one day gold became popular. It's that people who were accumulating silver over years witnessed the value of their wealth decline, whereas people who were accumulating gold over years witnessed the value of their wealth appreciate over and over and over again. So then, people who hold silver either understand this quickly and switch to gold and save some of their wealth, or they don't, and then they just witness their wealth continue to disappear more and more. So this is not a stable equilibrium, or I should say, having a harder money coexist with an easier money is not a stable equilibrium. It's a process that's on its way to being resolved in a different way. In other words, there's going to be a way in which the dynamic is going to continue to unfold, and then it's not going to remain like that. They can't coexist. It's like putting lions and lambs in a room. There's not going to be a room of lions and lambs. It just doesn't work. The lions are going to eat the lambs. It's just how it is, and that's the case with harder money. So, people will get over all of their hang-ups about anything if it means that it makes them better off. And money is one of the most important things like that. So people got over all of their hang-ups over gold. A lot of people liked glass beads and seashells and silver. And they all ended up using gold. So the reason for that is that easier money is constantly getting inflated in the supply. We're constantly making more of it. And so it loses its value and its liquidity. Because you make more of it, the amount of value stored in it is dissipated over more and more units of it, and so therefore the value that is stored in each particular unit declines. So that means that the amount of value stored in the network overall is, if you keep it constant but the number of units declines, you're essentially reducing the value there, and you're telling people that if they keep their money here, they're going to witness it lose its value. So what does that do? It encourages them to take their liquidity out, to take their wealth out of that money, which brings its price down. On the other hand, the harder money gains in value and liquidity because you can't make more of the supply, so people buy more and more of it, and when people buy more and more of it, you can't increase the supply as a response. So the only way to satisfy the increasing demand is for the price to rise. So that in turn attracts more buyers, which increases the liquidity, which attracts more buyers. So easier money gets inflated and loses value and liquidity, while harder money gains value and liquidity. And more liquidity means more salability. In other words, the more people have cash balances in a form of money, the more that thing is usable as a form of money. What determines the salability primarily is, in my mind, the size of the cash balances that exist in that money. In other words, if everybody is holding cash balances in dollars, or if the majority of cash balance is in dollars, then dollars is the dominant form of money, and this is the case right now. It's the most saleable. If you had something to sell, you're most likely to find somebody offer you dollars for it. And if you have something to buy, you're most likely to, if you want to buy something, you're most likely to be able to buy it if you offer people dollars. Because the vast majority of people have their cash balances in dollars. So they're most likely to conduct a trade in the thing in which they have the largest cash balance, which is the form of money. So if you find a way of increasing the value of the cash balances over time, you encourage people to put more cash balances in your money. If you find a way to decrease the value of your cash balances over time, you are discouraging people from putting their cash balances in your money. Basically, this is kind of an elaboration of this idea that I say in the Bitcoin Standard, which is why the harder money wins. Everybody wants the most liquid and the hardest money, or that results in the hardest money becoming the most liquid money. This is why the hardest money is the most saleable money, because it has the most amount of cash balances in it. So this is why I think Bitcoin will continue to scale, because demand for Bitcoin as a hard money is going to continue to rise regardless of the limitations of the blockchain. People would ultimately rather accept second layer Bitcoin that they can't use on chain, rather than accept first layer shitcoins, first layer easy money that loses value, first layer US dollars. Although no such thing as first layer US dollar really, because you can't have a US dollar full node, as we've discussed. But The point is that dollars in all their forms are inferior to second layer Bitcoin, because at least the dollars continue to lose value, whereas Bitcoin maintains its value. So this is why I think Bitcoin scaling is not going to be something that happens on chain. And Bitcoin doesn't need to scale on chain. And the reason for that is that Bitcoin transactions are cash. They're not non-cash transactions, the 3 billion daily transactions that we mentioned in the beginning of the chapter or this lecture. These 3 billion daily non-cash transactions are transactions essentially being conducted with third parties. In other words, you pay your local restaurant with your credit card. Your credit card company and your bank and their bank are sorting things out. So, you get a green check that says, all right, the guy paid for his food, you can let him go. And on the back end, it's not like the money moved immediately. It's not like you actually took $20 from your account and gave it to the restaurant's account. On the back end, it's a long process that's going to take weeks to be conducted, where your bank and credit card company and his bank and payment processor are going to move the $20 and take some cut from it, from his account, from your account to his. So that's not comparable to Bitcoin, because a Bitcoin transaction involves the final settlement, the final movement of a good. And so we can think about the cash transactions or the digital transactions the digital non-cash transactions that are mentioned earlier, that are about 3 billion per day. These are not similar to on-chain transactions. These are similar to second layer solution transactions that can be built on top of Bitcoin, because Bitcoin on-chain transactions are more similar to final settlement transactions between financial institutions. People want hard money more than they want on-chain transactions, and therefore I think on-chain transactions are going to remain extremely scarce. So what happens to scarce things? Well, what happens to scarce things is that a market develops for them. Always the case. There is a market in all scarce things. And of course, that is even true even in the case when governments say you can't have a market in something. You haven't ended the market, you've just changed the cost and benefit analysis involved in being part of that market. So decades of prohibition for drugs have not ended the market for drugs. Drugs are still a multi-billion-dollar industry. All that they've done is that they've changed the cost-benefit analysis involved. So instead of drugs being something that is cheap and low risk and massively abundant, now they're more expensive perhaps, and there is a big risk involved in working in them. But in any case, that's a digression. The point is that markets can't be stopped. There's always a market in every way, in anything in which there is scarcity. And Bitcoin block's case is scarce, and it has a market. There's only 1 megabyte every 10 minutes, 1 to 2 megabytes every 10 minutes. And it's like think about it as like a shuttle bus driving between two towns, and every 10 minutes there's a new bus that leaves, and it has this many people on it, and every 10 minutes there's a bidding war that takes place for who is going to get in. And so it's not like there's a fixed fee for this bus. It's not like pay $1 and then you get in. No, every 10 minutes, depending on how many people there are, the bus owner conducts an auction outside and sells the spots on the bus to the highest bidders. So this is really a very simple way of thinking about Bitcoin's block, and it's, I believe, 100% accurate. The block size is like a bus, and it fits a certain amount of data, and everybody wants to get their data in on this, and everybody who wants to get their data in has to outbid everybody else. Or has to outbid enough people in order to be able to get in. So, you want to be part of the 50 people who pay the highest so that you can get into the bus. Or you want to be part of the top 2,000, 3,000 transactions every 10 minutes so that you get into this block. So, if we look at the market for Bitcoin block space, we see this is the transaction count. We see this gray line. It's growing. So the number of transactions has grown, but it has pretty much stabilized since 2015 around this range, or 2016 or so. It has stabilized around this range of a few 100,000 transactions per day. So once we hit that point around 2015-16, and I remember 2015-16 there was a lot of FUD and doom-saying about Bitcoin that, look, we're hitting the limit. You know, we had all of this growth from 2010, 2009 to 2015, but now we were hitting the upper limit, and now Bitcoin is going to die because we can't just keep going. You know, in the mind of people who wanted to make the blocks bigger, this line should have just continued to grow like this. You know, we should be today at around 1 billion transactions, but instead that line started to decrease its speed of its growth, and when it got here 2014-15, they started to say this is a crisis, Bitcoin is going to die. But yet here we are, it's barely grown. So we've gone from around 100,000 to 250,000 in the last 6 or 7 years. We've barely grown, and in fact, since early 2016, in 6 years, it's practically flat. So the number of daily transactions has been flat in terms of on-chain transactions on Bitcoin. However, the total volume of transactions, the economic value of all the transactions that have been sent, is enormous. It continues to grow. Even as this has flattened out, the value of the transactions has continued to grow. So you see here, currently the value of the transactions that are being transacted daily is just, it hasn't flattened out. It continues to grow as Bitcoin grows and as the price of Bitcoin grows. And that is because the average transaction value increases. In other words, what's happening is that the number of transactions in Bitcoin remains the same, but the value of each transaction is increasing. And that's exactly what you expect to see in a market for a scarce good. If you have a piece of land, let's say, or a city in which land is, there's a market in land and there's an amount of land in that city, over time, as the value of the land in the city goes up, you would expect the least productive uses of land to be driven out of the city and to go to places where they can use cheaper land. So that's why you don't see a lot of cows grazing in Manhattan. In fact, you don't see any cows grazing in Manhattan because cows can graze anywhere. So you can buy real estate in very isolated areas away from people for which there's no demand, and the cows would go and graze there. Whereas New York real estate gets allocated to much more high margin uses, to people who can use it much more productively. So the value of production that takes place in real estate that is scarce, that is very valuable, that is in high demand, continues to go up. Over time, the productivity of an office in New York continues to go up because the most productive are the ones that are able to afford it. The last couple of years might be a little bit different because of other problems, but generally, when something is scarce and desirable, the productivity of its use continues to go up because the people who use it most productively are the ones who are able to outbid the ones who use it less productively. And so we see the same thing happening here with Bitcoin, the average value of the Bitcoin transaction. So whereas it used to be that one transaction, the average transaction had something in the range of $10 of value in around 2011. As time has gone by, this has continued to increase steadily. Obviously, much more steadily than the increase in the transactions count. So we see here we've gone from around $10 per transaction to around $1,000 per transaction by 2014, and then now currently we're in the range of around $30,000, $20,000, $40,000 per transaction. We've gone from 10 to 30, 40,000. We've gone about a 3,000-fold increase in the average value of daily transactions every day over this period, while the number of transactions has not increased as much. And I think as time goes by, we're likely going to see this number of transactions line, the line for the number of transactions, we're going to see it remain constant, likely, but we're going to be seeing the value per transaction continue to increase, and we're going to be seeing the total volume of transactions continue to increase. So we see the total transaction volume has gone up from practically zero when Bitcoin had no price, all the way up to now somewhere in the range of the billions of dollars daily. So every day there's billions of dollars of Bitcoin that move on chain. And that, I think, will likely continue to grow, but I think this one line, the transaction count on chain, is unlikely to grow much. It might double, it might triple, but it won't move much. On a logarithmic scale, it's not going to continue to move this is how I think of the market for Bitcoin block size. And I think this is the kind of very basic economic analysis that is very powerful towards understanding how things work. Because of this change in the way that the price of Bitcoin or the value of Bitcoin transactions increases over time to include higher value transactions, we're going to see less valuable transactions go off the Bitcoin blockchain. So you can pay for small transactions on fiat at around 0 to 3%. You can pay somewhere between 0 to 3% fee on fiat transactions. And these kind of, so if you're doing, if you're paying for something that's not very valuable, if you're paying for something that's not very expensive, 0 to 3% is likely going to be pretty cheap. But as the value of your transaction goes up, 0 to 3% becomes more and more significant. In that case, it makes more sense to use Bitcoin. So as the value of the transaction rises, the likelihood that it will get into Bitcoin, that it will be used for Bitcoin, I would say rises. Low transaction fee use cases will inevitably be priced out of on-chain transactions. It's already happened with exchanges and casinos taking their transactions off-chain. There used to be a time, there was a Bitcoin exchange called Satoshi Dice, Bitcoin casino called Satoshi Dice, where all gambling transactions were being put on the Bitcoin blockchain. Because Bitcoin was so small at that time, that gambling casino was a significant player in the market that they could just put all of their gambles on-chain. And then eventually, once more people started using Bitcoin, that became expensive. They had to pay transaction fees, so they took it off-chain. And that's going to continue to happen. Exchanges don't trade all their Bitcoin on chain. They only trade on chain when they receive Bitcoin from you or when they send Bitcoin to you. But then everything that you do inside the exchange, sending money to other people in the exchange, trading with the exchange, margin trading, all of that stuff is done on the books, on the exchange's own books, not on the Bitcoin blockchain.
This podcast is also brought to you by the Bitcoin Way, your professional Bitcoin IT team offering you personalized, secure, and comprehensive solutions for every step along your Bitcoin journey. The Bitcoin Way offer live concierge service to guide you with your Bitcoin cold storage, running your node, privacy best practices, inheritance planning, corporate strategy, and multi-sig solutions. They don't touch your coins, they guide you through the process of acquiring your coins and securing them. If you'd like to make your setup safer and more reliable, book a consult with them and see what they have to suggest. If you want to give someone the gift of Bitcoin, get them this professional service that will ensure they start off knowing exactly how to manage their coins and not lose them. Go to thebitcoinway.com and start Bitcoining more confidently.
So we're going to continue to see more and more of these transactions priced off-chain as Bitcoin scales. Second layer scaling is the answer. And to really, I'm not saying this is what's going to happen, but to really demonstrate the concept of what I'm trying to communicate is second layer scaling is already there for Bitcoin. In that, the problem of scaling Bitcoin is essentially already solved because all the second layer solutions that exist on fiat can be done with Bitcoin. In other words, everything that is used on fiat today, PayPal, Visa, MasterCard, Venmo, Swift, everything that you use, Western Union, everything that fiat people use to send money across the world or across their coffee shops, cashier's counter, all of it can be used with US dollars, with euros, with yens, with yuans, with any currency, including Bitcoin. So all it would take for Visa or MasterCard is just add one trading pair, one extra currency. They already have 160, I think, currencies from all over the world. And you travel from a country that has dollars to a country that has yens, and you pay for yens and your account in dollar gets debited. There's an exchange rate, and that's what MasterCard and Visa do. So you can get all of that MasterCard, all of what MasterCard and Visa and all other fiat payments do, if you just had Bitcoin on the back end. In other words, as a final settlement, you just settled between those financial institutions with Bitcoins. So that can already be done, and 500,000 transactions online is more than enough for all of the world's central banks to settle with one another if we wanted to just implement it today. And of course, I don't say this as a a recommendation, or as saying that we should do that, or as saying that this is even likely. I'm just using it to illustrate the point that to try and again hammer the point that on-chain transactions are different from consumer payment transactions. So I think we're going to see second layer solutions built on top of Bitcoin that are going to dominate the scaling solution rather than fiat second layer scaling solutions. But we'll see. Maybe my inclination is that it's likely to be something like Lightning that is going to be the solution for scaling Bitcoin. We're going to be scaling Bitcoin through Bitcoin native second layer solutions. But it might be the case that fiat native solutions might still play a role in a Bitcoin world. I'm completely open to that possibility. This is the kind of question that is not easy to answer in advance. You just need to see how market participants decide and play with one another. So, And to illustrate why we will see second layer scaling is, we already see it. This is already happening. And when I wrote the Bitcoin Standard in 2017, 2018, this was already the case. We were already seeing many millions more of Bitcoin transactions being conducted off-chain than on-chain. Even before Lightning became a thing, exchanges carry out so many more trades on Bitcoin's balance, on their own balance sheet, than they carry out on Bitcoin's blockchain. And the same is true for basically any platform that utilizes Bitcoin on in its operations. Everything that is done with Bitcoin internally is done off-chain, and so a lot more is done in Bitcoin internally than is done on-chain. So on-chain continues to be for the most valuable transactions, for the ones that need the most security. Everything that needs less security ends up getting relegated from the main chain. So this is many ways. There are many ways in which we're going to see second layer scaling solutions. I think physical Bitcoin is one of these other ways. We're going to see more and more implementations of things that are physical, like the open dime. I think that's a way that you can scale Bitcoin, because an open dime can be moved and can carry transactions between can carry out hundreds of transactions without moving any Bitcoin on chain. Multi-sig transactions is another way you can scale, because opening multi-sig between different people allows people to continue to run a balance between one another. And that's basically the idea of how the Lightning Network works. The Lightning Network is an implementation of multi-sig, essentially. So the Lightning Network is an ecosystem of nodes that allows for an automated, fast, and cheap implementation of a multi-sig channel-based payment network. Lightning nodes open channels with one another by sending funds to a multi-sig address using an on-chain transaction, and each party keeps an individual balance on the multi-sig account, and the parties can pay each other by signing off-chain Lightning transactions that reflect their updated respective balances. So that's the essence of how the Lightning Network works. So you effectively it's like opening a bar tab with a bar. You just keep ordering things, and they just keep marking more things on your tab. And that's kind of how it works. Two people set up a multi-sig between one another, and there's a balance of coins that they put into that channel. So I have 10 Bitcoin, you have 5 Bitcoin, there's 15 Bitcoin on the channel. And then you and I can keep trading with one another, and we just keep updating the balance. So it used to be 10 and 5, but then I send you 3, so now I have 7, you have 8. And the next day you send me 2, and then I have a 9, you have 6. And so we just keep running the balance of these things on the channel as it is open, without having to make a new Bitcoin transaction for each one. We just make the transaction amongst ourselves, and then if we want to close the channel, when we stop these transactions, we close the channel, and then we both take whatever coins we have in there. So when either party chooses to close the channel, an on-chain transaction reflecting the result of all the off-chain balance updates is sent from the multi-sig channel address to the two parties with their respective outstanding balances. You don't need a channel with anyone you want to transact with. You need to find a connection and route through the channels. So some people think, well, that's complicated. You need to go and open a channel with somebody. Let's do transaction. Why not just send them? And the answer is that with channels, you don't have to open a channel directly with anybody. You can just go through other people. So channels route payments for other people, and they receive fees for routing those payments. That's effectively how the Lightning Network works. So setting up and closing a channel requires just 2 on-chain transactions, but can perform an infinite number of Lightning transactions. There's just simply no limits to how many transactions you can do between 2 nodes on a Lightning node. So the Lightning transactions are much cheaper than on-chain transactions, but the trade-off is that they have lower liquidity. This is the thing. The different, with Lightning, you can just basically get very, very, very cheap transactions. With you pay Satoshi as one Satoshi as a transaction fee, which is 1/5,000 of a dollar. And but with that, you pay very little transaction fee, but you're limited by the liquidity on the Lightning Network, which is less necessarily, without doubt, necessarily less than the liquidity that is on the Bitcoin network overall. So as we said, in terms of the liquidity and the salability, this is what really matters. And the lower the liquidity, the more expensive and time consuming the Lightning transactions. The higher the liquidity, the more liquid, the more saleable Bitcoin Lightning is, and the less time and cost is involved in making each Lightning transaction. So the limitation on Lightning scaling is the amount of liquidity that is in Lightning. So the provision of liquidity for the network is an economic decision by users. I think the main contribution that I'm trying to make from this chapter, if you're going to take away one lesson from it, which I think is an original contribution, because I haven't heard somebody say this about Lightning, is that we need to think of the decision to put money in a Lightning channel as being distinct from your decision to hold cash for yourself, for your spending. It is more similar to an investment. It's like investing in a payment services company. When you put your money in a Lightning node in order to route payments so that you could earn return on the Lightning node, then you are effectively investing. You're taking money away from your consumer goods. You're not consuming that money. You're not putting it into buying something that you can consume. You're taking the money and you're putting it in an investment, and you're putting it in a business. You're tying it up in a business so that it would earn a return, so that people can use your coins to route payments from their balances to other people. And so the more liquidity you put into your node, the more you invest in opening channels with others, the more liquid your node is, and the more fees will be earned from your nodes. And so this is, I think, an important distinction to make between the holding of money for the purposes of money as a cash versus holding money in a Lightning node in order to wire payments. Putting money in a Lightning node is a decision that you make in order to earn fees, so it's an investment. Holding money as cash is a decision you make so that you have money in the future with the least certainty, with the least risk. It doesn't offer a return, but it offers you less uncertainty than having an investment. The Lightning channel is more like an investment than a cash balance. So money held on a Lightning channel cannot be spent elsewhere, but it can earn a return. So the decision of how much to put in a Lightning channel is not the same as the decision to hold cash, since cash offers no return and is always available. And Lightning channels are not going to work based on people's cash holdings, but their investment in routing payments for fees. So what I'm trying to say is that the routing of payment on the Lightning Network is going to become an industry. It's not the Lightning Network is not going to scale and grow through everybody putting their spare change and everybody putting their checking account and opening 500 nodes with everybody they'll ever transact with on it. I don't think that's a sustainable model for scaling the Lightning Network, because I don't think there's I don't see that as being very efficient. The world is far more interconnected than it'll be efficient to keep opening nodes between people. So far more likely that what we're going to happen is that because of the fact that you can earn money from putting the cash in the Lightning Network, we're going to get people specialize in it. People are going to work in it. People are going to put money and time and effort into doing this and doing it well and doing it efficiently. And that's just going to mean specialization. And that's going to mean investment. It's going to mean people putting time, effort, money, specializing in routing payments and doing it well and doing it better than others. And then that becoming a business model. So then you end up with a world in which you have a very large number of Lightning nodes, but not a world in which everybody is running their own Lightning channel with everybody else. Everybody runs a Lightning channel with one major large node, and then these major nodes are connected to one another. In other words, we'd have a network of tens of thousands of Lightning nodes around the world that are well connected to one another, that each have many channels open. So within these very high capacity nodes, it's very easy to route between them because they're all very well connected. And then individuals will have just one or two or three or maybe a few nodes or a few channels open with a few of those. So I think the provision of liquidity is going to become something professional, and I think that's going to lead to something similar to a hub and spoke model, in that managing Lightning channels will just become a professional enterprise. Node liquidity will be a service. If you want, or channel liquidity will be a service. That will make management easier for individuals. It'll make professionals handle it, and then users will just need to basically click a button and everything will work on the back end. You're not going to have to worry about routing payments yourself. You're not going to have to figure out, how do I find a connection with this guy? You're not going to have to worry about earning fees and how much money am I going to earn, and is this going to be worthwhile? Can I cover my fees from can I cover my costs and transactions from earning fees? This is not something that people are going to handle individually because it's just another business. It's something that's going to be done professionally. In the same way that you don't get under the hood of what your bank does. You just deal with the bank. And you just open a channel with a few very liquid nodes. And of course here, it does look like it is a little bit more centralized. It seems like, oh wow, this is a centralized system. Well, I don't think so. It is more centralized than a world in which everybody puts their coffee on chain, but that's such a world I don't think is possible because of the reasons we mentioned earlier, because of decentralization. However, it is a lot more decentralized than what we have right now, which is a system of hub and spoke where there is one hub, one central bank, one fiat full node, one fiat central bank that is able to decide everything for everybody else, can determine the money supply, can decide who can join the network and who can exit the network. In the Lightning world, instead of having one central bank, we'd have tens of thousands of Lightning nodes, each one being essentially equal to all the others. Each one of them is completely sovereign. None of them can change the money supply. None of them can kick anybody off the network. None of them can censor anybody off the network. They can choose to censor individuals. I have a Lightning node. I can censor you by not opening a channel with you, but that's not really censorship. That's just me not wanting to buy something that you're selling, and me not wanting to sell you my transaction routing capacity. And it's not censorship if I can't stop you from using Lightning and Bitcoin yourself. So none of these nodes will have the ability to censor. None of these nodes will have the ability to alter the protocol. And none of these nodes will have the ability to change the money supply. So therefore, that, for me, removes all of the causes of dysfunction in fiat. The problem with fiat is the fact that it is centralized, and therefore the people in charge of it can essentially change the rules. But with Bitcoin, if the rules are protected, then this inevitable centralization of management of Lightning channels that's going to result in, instead of us having a world of 8 billion central banks, each able to perform international settlement from their own node, so we'll have a world of tens of thousands of nodes that are all able to perform international clearance, and each individual has the ability to perform international clearance as well, because you can just transact on chain, because everybody's mainly using Lightning, but of course there's still 500,000 on-chain transactions, and if push comes to shove, you can route your own payments, you can make your own channel, you can send your own transactions on chain. So the fact that you can just get out of any single Lightning node provider and start your own The fact that you can just go to their competitor is what makes the difference between Bitcoin and fiat, and what it means, the whole world of difference. That's essentially what I think Bitcoin has got a much better chance than gold at this, because ultimately, even at the most kind of centralized way that Bitcoin ends up, we still end up with thousands of Lightning nodes able to route payments worldwide, unable to influence the monetary policy, and open for anybody to enter and compete with. I think if you had something similar, there is no way that you would develop fiat cancer on top of it. I mean, well, no way is a little too strong, but I think it's highly unlikely. So what are the risks and the trade-offs here? Censorship resistance is a risk, in a sense that the more people are reliant on Lightning, the more they become reliant on individual Lightning operators handling their transactions. But again, that risk here is very different from under fiat. Under fiat, if you get debanked, if you get unbanked, you're done. There's no all right, I'm just going to go to the other bank in town. You're done. Whereas with Lightning, if you get censored by a Lightning node, you can just learn to run your own. It does become more centralized and less of a peer-to-peer system, as I was saying. That is a risk. But I think the key point to understand, as I was saying here, is that even though it's more centralized in this way, it's not centralized in a way that compromises the important characteristics of Bitcoin. I think the one important distinction I'd like to make in this chapter, and in this lecture, is the idea that there is a middle ground in terms of decentralization, where Bitcoin can be decentralized enough to resist capture and altering its monetary policy. Bitcoin can be decentralized enough so that governments can't just shut it down. Governments can't change the code and make it so that we have a new amount of Bitcoin every year, so that the supply continues to grow at a constant growth rate. I don't think these are likely, and Bitcoin needs to be decentralized to resist that. I don't think Bitcoin needs to be decentralized enough for you to be able to do your coffee transaction on chain. That's the distinction that I'd like to make in this chapter, that we can have off-chain coffee transactions. You can you can even trust an intermediary for your coffee transaction, but as long as the underlying infrastructure, as long as the underlying monetary rails and the monetary asset is free from central command, then we're good. Then, all right, maybe somebody might be able to censor you individually, but then you can figure out your way around it if you care. And they can't censor and control the network. That's the important thing. I think the important thing for Bitcoin is to just remain decentralized enough to avoid centralized capture and changing the monetary policy and censorship resistance. Processing individual payments on chain, I think, is an unrealistic goal and also an unnecessary goal. Thank you.